Welcome to the Darnell and Cody show, where we discuss social, political, and philosophical issues relevant to us as a society. Today's topic is reparations, and we don't mean reparations as it purely relates to black people for slavery, though that will be one of our central points of discussion. We're going to talk about reparations as a concept as well and its application throughout history. Reparation means paying money to those that have been wronged. So, strictly speaking, reparation isn't necessarily limited to being paid for by the offender. This is something to keep in mind as we continue this discussion. Now, there's been a lot of talk recently about giving reparations to black people for slavery and perhaps more reasonably for the acts of Jim Crow. This is controversial for many reasons. In the former case, it's nearly impossible to accurately determine and verify the ancestry of every black person to see if their ancestors have been slaves. But for the sake of argument, let's assume that we could determine that accurately. Who should pay for the reparations? For example, should Hispanics and Asians be liable to pay for the slavery of black people hundreds of years ago? Or what about the first and second generation of white immigrants from Greece, Italy, Ireland, and so on? Should they take part in paying for the reparation? What about someone that's half white and half black? Do they pay half the reparations and get paid half the reparations? No one that has been a slave is alive today. No one that has owned a slave is alive today. Even if you could accurately determine the descendants of slave owners, should they be held liable to pay for reparations for something they had no part in? But why stop there? Shouldn't the Chinese railroad workers that were forced to work in comparable situations also then get paid reparations? These are all the complications that come from paying for reparations for slavery. And these problems extend to the reparations in regards to Jim Crow. Reparations for the effects of Jim Crow can still be seen. Blacks were not allowed to have proper housing, and the institutional systemic racism has affected the black community directly and unquestionably. But having a claim to reparation is different from the question of whether or not they should actually get the reparation. Again, the question becomes from who? What do you think about this, Cody?
Well, I agree with you 100% there that it's kind of it becomes an extremely complicated issue when so much time has passed since these things have happened. Even with the Jim Crow laws, that was in the 1960s and 1950s, really, and as well as prior, there were discriminations that were going on throughout America against Black people, and even in the North. So that was still quite a while ago, and trying to find the right group of people to blame or to pay for all of this is troubling to do in the current age when these things aren't recent events, and it's a lot easier to do reparations if they have happened in the last 15 or 20 years, maybe is even stretching it. And as you said with the slavery thing, it is incredibly hard to try and figure out who directly suffered from this, as well as whose family was in America during the time that was benefiting from this. A lot of people, like you mentioned, that have immigrated here had no business with what was happening during the Civil War and prior to that, and even up into the Jim Crow laws. A lot of American families have come here after that, and they're tax-paying citizens, and it doesn't seem just to hold them accountable for things that they aren't responsible for. But at the same time, obviously there are communities that are, as you said, still feeling the effects of Jim Crow to this day. So it is an extremely complicated issue. And I feel like most of the people who are talking about doing reparations really haven't acknowledged the complications that are involved or fully thought this issue out.
I can't agree with you
yeah,
more.
that's what my position.
Right. I really don't see many people talking about this when, Democrats, who are mostly the proponents of paying for reparations, they don't really mention the nuances that go along with it. They just, seem to pander to their voting demographic. But one of the forms of reparations, I think, is arguably affirmative action. And while affirmative action is by itself a rather more racist than counter-racist idea, taken in the context that it's a reparation, it seems more benign and reasonable. What do you think about that, Cody?
I think that this was genuinely enacted back in 1961 by Lyndon B. Johnson, the president at the time, to basically do reparations to the black communities that had suffered, especially from the Jim Crow laws. So the affirmative action was signed into law specifically, and I quote here, promote the full realization of equal employment, unquote. And it also requires by law that employers do not discriminate against any person, regardless of religion, color, ethnicity, national origins, etc., etc. And I think that it was a good form of reparations, especially during the time that it was enacted. There were hard hit black communities and poor black people all over the country that were genuinely discriminated against in the workforce. That's been historically proven in America during the time. But what's interesting is that this has continued for what is almost 60 years now into the modern day, in 2019. And in 2003, the Supreme Court ruled that educational institutions are allowed to consider race as a factor for admitting students. And this has really caused the crux of the issue with affirmative action, in my opinion, is this ruling that the Supreme Court had back in 2003. Because this basically put the Asian communities at an enormous disadvantage despite being a minority community still. And the Asian community now is essentially forced to compete and fight essentially for a slot to any college, really. And they're required to perform incredibly high academically wise in comparison to their peers of other ethnicities. And it's just obviously unfair to the Asian communities at this point because of how well they're doing and how much they're overachieving in comparison. And yet their acceptance rates are still around the rates that are acceptable for quote unquote having an Asian community at a campus. Because these colleges are basically now saying, oh, well, we need to have diversity at our colleges. So what does this mean? Well, it doesn't just mean that we let minorities in, but it also means that we have to have a mix of minorities. And it also means that we have to have a certain number of white people there as well. So instead of having a community that is a majority Asian because of how well they're achieving and they're justifiably doing the work and deserve a position more than other people, despite that fact, they're still admitting people based on solely a diverse reasoning and having a diverse campus, quote unquote. And as I said, this is just hurting other communities, specifically the Asian community right now, which is the overachieving community at this moment.
Right, and it's really something that's gross if you really think about it. It's basically you're forced to be viewed as just black or just Asian or just whatever, and not your individual merits. So for race to be considered is very demoralizing and very in a way dehumanizing. You're not being looked upon as who you are as a human being and a person. You're being marginalized as this race. So you're Asian, doesn't matter. You're just this Asian demographic group. Doesn't matter who you are as an individual. Doesn't matter that you studied hard for yourself as an individual, not to represent some demographic that's imaginary. And it's baffling, right? The whole ideal of equality and equal participation backfires into something that's very grim and backwards thinking. But going back to how this relates to reparation, I think the question is, was affirmative action, or is affirmative action as it is today, enough? Or does it fall short of what many people are calling for? Essentially, they want monetary compensation for the effects of Jim Crow and slavery. What do you think about that, Cody? Do you think that affirmative action was sufficient, is sufficient, or do you think that affirmative action should be, in a way, done with? Maybe the price has been paid in a sense. What do you think about that, Cody?
Well, it's a complicated issue as to whether Black people have received full reparation for specifically the Jim Crow laws. As I said, the slavery thing, it is just too far back to even really consider in my mind. But the Jim Crow law, that is 60 years ago, roughly, as well. A little over 60, 70-ish. But the affirmative action absolutely is not working anymore for the reasons that I've stated, where it's hurting other communities at the benefit of Black communities in particular. And the whole purpose, as I had said, is to promote full realization of employment, and that extends to education now, according to the Supreme Court as of 2003. And that's equal employment and education. And Asian communities specifically are not looking at equal employment right now. And in fact, Black communities are not looking at equal employment. They're looking at uh, an advantage that is overwhelming in comparison to some communities. And that is an issue that should be addressed not by the schools themselves, but by the government, in my opinion, that enacted these Jim Crow laws. And the affirmative action, as I said, this is a law that's in place by the government, but now that they've extended it to private institutions like schools to try and figure out what this exactly means for themselves and how they want their communities and campuses to look, it's become a much more complicated issue. And the bottom line is that I feel affirmative action has run its course, and perhaps the Black community needs something else to fully reparate for the affirmative action. I mean, the Jim Crow laws that had happened. But affirmative action is no longer the answer. And honestly, I'm not really sure that the Black communities are able to really get something that's going to be meaningful enough to them. I'm not sure that, like, money isn't going to be the answer, in my opinion. You can't just hand a community money and wash away your sins. Are able to really get something that's going to be meaningful enough to them. I'm not sure that, like, money isn't going to be the answer, in my opinion. You can't just hand a community money and wash away your sins, especially when so much damage has been done for such a long time. You need to fix the communities up in some way, socially, perhaps with programs. But that would be the best form of reparation if they got it at all.
Right, and I agree with that. Money won't solve the problem, but it's kind of like it will help at least, right? It can't hurt, in my opinion. But you bring up a fair point in that we do need a better program, and affirmative action is not that program any longer. It's not gonna fix these problems. So what kind of social programs do you imagine would be somewhat effective as a form of
Well,
reparation?
I think government funding specifically to, like, urban communities, and I'm pretty sure that there is some kind of funding. I'm not sure if the government actually does any kind of funding for this, or if it's all coming from private organizations that fund the urban communities. But really, education, I think me and you both would agree, is the root of building a community and building people themselves. And if you can get the education and the schooling in these downtrodden communities that have been hurt by Jim Crow laws for an extended period of time, and also maybe job programs, teaching them how to do trade schools type careers like locksmithing and plumbing and those kinds of good jobs that you can live on. And something along those lines, I think, would be a better solution than what we have in place right now. And as I said, that needs to be government funded, not just private organizations doing it as they are currently.
Right, and I think I agree with you on that. Essentially, right, and if I'm not misunderstanding you, you're basically saying that we need to move away from reparations in the sense that we have to stop viewing it as a reparation and look at it more as an investment, not just for Black people's benefit, but as a benefit for all people across the board. Because ultimately, the better that minorities and people that are in impoverished conditions, the better they do, the better it benefits all of us. So I think I agree with you in that we need to look for a program, we need to look for ideas and policies that is more empowering than just looking at it as, well, you were, a victim of the past, so here's some money, or here's this little benefit for you for going to college or whatever. Instead of that, we need to look for a policy that empowers people and saying, we're going to invest in your future, and here we're going to do what it takes to make some policies that help you, empower you. I think that's the vision, that's the answer, really. But going back to reparations, we can't ignore the Native Americans when we talk about this topic, because they suffered even more than the slaves did, in my view. They were quite literally almost eradicated, both territorially and as a population. They received reparations in the form of reservations, among other benefits, and there's little to no controversy in regards to this, in regards to whether or not they should have gotten this as a reparation. Taking this into consideration, don't Black people of slave ancestry have a sort of precedent to demand reparations? What do you think about that?
Well, it's a good point to raise, and I see where you're coming from there. But I feel as though the Native American thing, first of all, was prolonged for a lot longer. That was going on basically since white people came to America. That was white people killing Native Americans, essentially, was what was happening, and running them out of their ancestral lands. And that had happened until there was basically no more lands left except for the reservations that we've given them. And obviously, the Native Americans that first encountered white people never saw the reparations, but I feel as though the people that were suffering up into the bitter end, essentially, as I want to call it, the people that were being at war with America and fighting with American troops, they got to see the reparations in the form of their reservations and a bit of money. Although, obviously, looking back in hindsight, we essentially scammed the Native American communities out of their lands for pennies of what it was worth, essentially. But the people that were fighting at that time, they were alive to see that happen. And the slaves, all of them are dead. No one that was a slave is alive today. So it's much harder to give the reparations to people that are ancestors of somebody than to just directly give the community that you essentially screwed over the reparations. And that's what we did with the Native Americans. We screwed them over for a very long time, and then we said, here's your reparations. And the people that were alive at the time of the fighting got those reparations. And that's not the case with the slavery, which is what makes it so complicated and so hard to figure out who should pay for it and all these other complications that come with it. And as you said, it's extremely hard to track down and prove the legitimacy of someone's ancestral claim to being a slave's descendant, because the slave owners didn't really keep track of all of this. Freed slaves, people that escaped to the north, really didn't know who they were related to or where their family members had gotten. There were so many issues and just all kinds of crazy stuff going on at the time. And it really was just hard to record all of the things that were going on. And so we don't have a lot of these records that would help people prove their legitimacy.
Right. And, well, to the point of Native Americans seeing, right. And to the point of Native Americans seeing the reparations while also simultaneously having been killed and suffering from American troops, I think even today they enjoy a certain form of affirmative action. They enjoy a certain benefits from the government. Wouldn't you say that's the case? Wouldn't you say that It's a prolonged more than just merely they got their reparations is over. It's a continuing system. It's a continuing form of reparation. Wouldn't you say that that's the case as well? So, for instance, the Native Americans of today, for instance, didn't fight for their land. They weren't kicked out of their land directly. They're just the descendants, but they're still enjoying a lot of these benefits. What do you say to that?
Yeah, that's an interesting point as well. It's just the matter of which form of reparation you're asking for, really. And I don't see any Black Americans requesting like territory for their own communities, like sovereign from the United States. I don't think anyone has requested that. At least that's in their right mind. And honestly, it would be an interesting point to raise because that's kind of what we do with the Native Americans is we've literally given them sovereign land where even our police have to get permission from their police to go into these reservations to do like work there, police work. Um, um, they're straight up sovereign, and that's the agreement we made with their ancestors, so that the heirs of those ancestors to this day are receiving those benefits. Black communities that are descendants of slaves aren't asking for territory; they're asking for monetary compensation, and it doesn't seem to me that they're asking for like money over time throughout their lives. They're not asking for $200 every week or something like that for the rest of their life. They're asking for like an upfront amount, at least as far as I understand it. So maybe it would make more sense even to pay people money slowly throughout their lives. If you're a descendant of an ancestor of slavery, it's like, all right, well, we will pay you $200 every 2 weeks or 1 week or whatever the money that is agreed upon is. But it seems to me that they're just asking for this upfront amount, and then it's going to be over with? Question mark. Like, what about their children? Are they gonna make a new demand later? It seems confusing to me how exactly what they want.
Right, it's a confusing or
And as you mentioned the Native Americans, it's another thing to mention is the Japanese internment camps that happened during World War II. Which was, of course, the American government once again imprisoning fellow Americans, this time Japanese Americans. These were mostly citizens. Only about a quarter of these Japanese people were imprisoned were actually immigrants, and most of these were legal immigrants. It's estimated at least 98% of them were legal immigrants. So we imprisoned over 100,000 Japanese Americans. And what's interesting to note is, though there was a population of 150,000 in Hawaii of Japanese American population, only 1,500 of them were imprisoned in Hawaii. And the reasons for this are kind of speculated. Mostly people think there would just be general outrage, essentially, if such a high amount of their community was imprisoned all at once. But it is well agreed upon, including by the American government. During the 1988, the American government finally agreed that this was the reason why these people were imprisoned was for racist reasons. There was no reason to doubt these people's loyalty to America. They were just imprisoned for being Japanese. And the American government agreed it was racist to do so. So out of those more than 100,000 Japanese American people that were imprisoned, only 82,000 received reparations in 1888, and some of them weren't alive, so their heirs inherited this reparation from the American government. But the biggest problem I had with this form of reparation was came a little bit too late because the people died before all of them were able to get it. Some people, or about 50% of them, were still alive when they got this reparation, and otherwise their heirs had to claim this reparation. And the other problem is that not all of the people that were imprisoned got reparation. only 82,000 of the 100 plus thousand American or Japanese Americans got this reparation, and they got 1.6 billion, which is equivalent to a little over 3 trillion in today's economy in US dollars. So it was a pretty hefty amount of money that they got from the US government that paid for this reparation. And the American government seems like this was like the first time that they really owned up to screwing up big time with racism, essentially, and then doing the monetary payout, and then it being a done deal. No Japanese American is talking about this anymore. And it's interesting that the American government did this with the Japanese, and they never thought of doing this with the black communities back in the day. This happened in '88. As I said, we paid out the Japanese internment camp individuals. It doesn't seem like it ever crossed Lyndon B. Johnson's mind to just pay reparations to people that suffered from Jim Crow. He wanted to do the affirmative action instead. So it's just interesting how this worked so much differently than everything else.
Right. And I wasn't responsible for the Japanese internment camps. I had no part in that, right? And I had no part in Jim Crow. But as an American, I'm not against paying for reparations because of Americans' wrongdoing. So that's something that I come to realize now as we're having this discussion. Yes, I wasn't a slave owner. My ancestors weren't slave owners. I came here way later than when any of that happened. But as an American, in some way, even if I'm not responsible for the sins of America, by becoming a citizen, by being a citizen, I'm liable to a certain extent and responsible to pay for America's wrongdoing. But I guess the question now becomes really, what should they get? How much? Should it be money? Should it be policy? And I think these are the things that aren't really being discussed as far as the current political platforms are concerned. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yeah, I first want to just go back to the fact that, you said something about being liable as an American citizen. I wouldn't necessarily agree with us being like liable or necessarily like it's not required of us, I
Right.
don't think.
I wouldn't say we're
But it's
morally
also,
culpable. We're not morally responsible, but as an entity, I would say that we have to share in, taking the burden of the sins of our government.
yeah, exactly. We have to acknowledge that, we want America to be the best that it possibly can be. And part of that is owning up to America's mistakes, regardless of whether we had any wrongdoing ourselves. We might have had absolutely nothing to do with it, as is the most of every American's case. But at the same time, we have to love our country and be willing to, as you said, basically pay for our sins to make ourselves better. And that's just I wanted to clarify there.
Right. And now, if you look at a more recent case of reparations, let's look in the case of World War I, where Germany was essentially forced to pay for reparations caused by a war that started because Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated. When they demanded reparations from Serbia for this, Russia got involved on the side of Serbia, and eventually Great Britain and France. Regardless of who was truly at fault here, the people of Germany had to bear the great burden of paying for these reparations, which historians agree is what led to the rise of Hitler and World War II. The reason why I bring this up is because it's something to consider when we talk about reparations. We have to be aware of the consequences. What will be the consequence of paying for reparations of slavery in this modern age? How much should the reparations be per person? Who should bear the burden of paying for it? What are the social and political consequences that can arise from this happening? Right. So we talked about the other two. Let's talk about the last one. What are the social and political consequences that can arise from reparations being paid to Black people in this modern age? What do you think about that?
I think we would see quite a bit of people that are displeased with the outcome of that, and it would be I feel a social dichotomy between the left and the right, essentially, where the left wants to pay for the reparations, and a lot of people on the right would not be happy with how this is working out. And I might be wrong. Maybe the right would totally be fine with it, or the majority of the right, or whatever. But I feel like a lot of people would become resentful of this, and I don't think it would lead to any kind of national crisis, and to the point where Nazi Germany is rising in America or anything like that. That would be insane. But I feel like it would cause some discontent with a certain group of people, and perhaps the majority of people, to be honest. I'm not sure that, as we've mentioned, a lot of these immigrant families that have come over here would be exactly happy about paying for this either. Even if, as we've said, you paying for America's sins and all these things. It just seems like um, just a flat out a large sum amount of money at once would cause a lot of issues politically and socially. And I think that the best way we kind of agreed on was to do the social programs which would benefit not just the communities that were uh, completely destroyed by Jim Crow laws or totally disenfranchised by redlining and all these other things, but also help other disenfranchised communities as well that are just struggling all across America. I think that's the best approach. And as for, you said earlier, you're becoming okay with paying for reparations, essentially. I kind of see where you're coming from, where we have paid for the Japanese internments, and it would be nice for the Black community to finally get this. Here's what we did wrong. This is why it was wrong, and this is what we're going to do better, type of thing. I think that would be really powerful for America as a country to do for the Black community.
Right. So as long as we can truly verify, who actually suffered, as opposed to, well, you're a black person from Africa. Right. So as long as we can truly verify, who actually suffered, as opposed to, well, you're a black person from Africa that came in 2012 here.
Yeah, that's another good point.
Right.
There's plenty of immigrants that there. A lot of our new nurses are actually coming from Africa because they're getting trained over there, and they know that they can make a lot more money here. So yeah, there's a lot of African immigrants that are coming here, and obviously, yeah, you can't just, okay, well, all black people get reparations. Yeah, that's not the way it should be either.
Right. And the final thing I want to mention was the Holocaust. So the Jews received billions of dollars worth of reparations, which would be worth trillions in the modern day for the atrocities that occurred. They were able to get reparations. So what prevents black people from getting theirs? That's another thing to consider when we talk about, is there a statute of limitation regarding reparations? Is it something that has to do with timing rather than the actual act? Of course, we can't pay for every historical atrocity. Who is to pay for the atrocity that happened in the 10th century, for example, right? It'd be ridiculous to try to find someone or find some government entity to pay for, something that happened in 1802. But then the question becomes, what is the time limit, so to speak? Or perhaps more importantly, what should be the time limit in regards to these things? You mentioned the Japanese internment camps, and they got their reparations fairly quickly because it's more immediate and direct. But for something like slavery, or in general, if there's another atrocity that happens, should there be a statute of limitation? And if so, what should be the time limit? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, I just want to clarify for the Japanese internments. It was quick in comparison to these other reparations that we've kind of talked about here. Really, besides the Jewish reparations in the form of monetary gain, and as well as the country of Israel, essentially. The Japanese internment reparations were given in 1988, so that was over 40 years after they were imprisoned, which is why only 50% of the people were still alive. So it wasn't exactly like expedited reparations that was done immediately afterward. And as I said earlier, I believe, I honestly feel as though like 20 years is really like that's when you know that the full generation of people that has suffered from this terrible atrocity, whatever it was, they're going to gain directly from the reparations. And I'm not against people's descendants gaining from reparations instead of them if it takes too long, but it just adds a lot more complications. It can't be nearly as easy as just giving the people a flat out amount of money because they suffered from whatever has happened to them. There's just a lot of time that has passed if it's longer than 25 years, and people have died. People have, you've lost track of certain people. You have no idea who certain people are that are claiming reparations that for this thing after 25. Like, it's just, it's not necessarily wrong, and it's not necessarily impossible, but it adds a lot of complications. And as I said, I feel like if you get it done within 20 years of something happening, it really just makes things so much more simple. And obviously, we can't just go back in time and fix Jim Crow law and do reparations in 1980. But it is much more complicated now that it's happening, or we're discussing it in 2019.
Right. And I know I put you on the spot a lot, but it's not so you can give us a solution. It's more like, let's think about it on the fly. What can we do, right? And I think this is what is missing in the current discussion as far as politicians are concerned. I've never seen anybody really taking the time to discuss, well, instead of just saying, let's give reparations, what are the implications of reparations and what are the actual details that kind of relate to this issue? And ultimately, it is complicated, and we're not here to give solutions necessarily. We're more so here to just ask the right questions and get people interested, because the what's more important than fixing problems is to know the problem and understand the problem, because we don't want to just apply bandages. We want to get to the heart of the issue, perform these precise surgeries that will regulate the system and make it working functionally again.
Yep, exactly. There's no reason to hide from these issues, but there's also no reason to try and like oversimplify them and just make it about talking points and red versus blue, essentially.
Right. And I think that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for tuning in, guys.
Thanks very much.